Hey, this is Chris. Welcome back to another episode of San Diego's Historic Backcountry. Today I am in the Julian Cemetery looking around. Didn't really plan to come here today, but it sort of worked out that way, so I thought I'd come up and walk around and see which of the pioneer people I could find in the cemetery. And Julian Cemetery is actually really special. If you've never been here, if you're at all familiar with the history of the Julian Cuyamaca Laguna area, this is really a fascinating place to come because it really is a who's who of pioneer families in the cemetery. We'll take a look around. I'll show you some of these people and tell you a little bit of the history, but there's people like the McCain family has a big section here, the Dailies, the town founders of Julian, the Bailey family. Just the list goes on. And I came here today knowing that I was going to film people like Drew Bailey and people who founded Julian and some of these other ranch families. And I ended up finding a couple graves that really kind of hit me. I have to admit, they were people who I knew, people who I had met in the past, especially right when I was getting started in my historical interest, like right when I was in high school or shortly thereafter. I met some of these people. And people watching this will probably remember a couple of these people too. We'll get into it here as we look around the cemetery a bit. So let's look around the Julian Pioneer Cemetery. So one thing I always try to keep in mind when I'm looking at a small town cemetery like this is you have to realize a lot of these pioneers of Julian, at least the ones who stayed in town after the town was founded, they all lived here at the same time. So when we see a cemetery like this, we see individual headstones and markers kind of separated apart from each other. That's sort of the appearance of it, but in reality, what we're looking at here is a community. These are people who all knew each other for the most part. They went to each other's christenings, weddings, funerals. They were classmates in school. This is a community that's up here. So when you look at the names in the cemetery and then you look at the history of the town, you find out these people whose headstones we see, they're all intertwined back in their day, even though there's several different generations. But even at that, the generations are intertwined as well. So something to keep in mind as we look around an old cemetery like this. One of the aspects about Julian history is a little bit unusual for an 1870s mining town is that there were several African American families who were kind of instrumental in the early development of the town. Gold was discovered by Fred Coleman, who was an African American man who'd come from back east. He discovered gold in what's now known as Coleman Creek, down sort of on the way toward Wynola. And then there were several other families in Julian who were business owners and sort of instrumental in the development of the town. So another important couple who are in the cemetery were Albert Robinson and his wife Margaret. They were another African-American couple who'd come from back east. Albert and Margaret were ranchers to begin with, apparently, but then they started a little hotel in Julian, which after many trials and tribulations over the years and expansions, eventually became the Julian Hotel that we know today. And in this historic photo, we can see that's Margaret Robinson right in the middle there, standing out toward the front. And then Albert is the fellow all the way over on the right by the fence post with the white shirt on and a white brim hat. Very heavy mustache. He had a real heavy mustache in those years. So Albert is in the cemetery. Margaret, after Albert died, Margaret moved away and probably remarried, and she's not in the Julian Cemetery, but Albert Robinson is. So a very prominent early Julian family. And then the other noteworthy African-American pioneer in Julian was America Newton. She actually lived just down the hill to the west of Julian, where when you're coming up on Highway 78, those last few curves right before you come up into town, that actually used to be called America Grade after her. She used to do seamstress work. I think she did laundry and things. She also had a very popular water trough on the hill coming up there for freight wagons and things coming up that last steep hill into Julian. So America Newton is in the right up at the top of the hill in the Julian Cemetery as well. So after gold was discovered in Julian and the mining frenzy had begun, it was Drew Bailey, with his family members who set out to lay out the town. He named it after his cousin Mike Julian. Drew Bailey and his wife Annie are both here in the cemetery. Mike Julian is not. I'm not sure where he ended up. But the Baileys had a lot of kids, and some of them were fairly well known as well. This is a big Bailey family plot in here. So they had several daughters who married into other families. They're all here, quite a large family plot. And then the one daughter who's fairly noteworthy in Julian history was Ida Bailey. She became Ida Bailey Wellington, and she's right here. If you've ever done any historic research in the backcountry, you've probably seen her name because she amassed a very large collection of memorabilia and photographs and such on the history of Julian and the Cuyamaca area. Many, many items, say from the Ida B. Wellington collection on them. Almost any historical collection you go to has things from the Ida B. Wellington collection. And then as you look around in the Bailey family plot here, there's a whole bunch of in-laws over here. The Kitchen family was over here. Helen, I believe, was a Bailey granddaughter who married into that family. And then Gus Redmond was Annie Bailey's half-brother, and Gus Redmond was very well known in the Julian and Banner mining districts. He owned several mines. It was a Redmond mine, but he was also involved in other mines, some of them even out into the desert areas as well in later years, so he was quite well known. So Leroy Wilcox and his two sons, Lauren and Horace, were also very prominent in early Julian history. They were involved in several different businesses, and we're probably going to see them in a future video that I'll make about some wagon road features that they were involved in. This is the son Horace here. I'm not sure if Lauren is in the cemetery or not. I didn't really notice him, but we'll probably be revisiting the Wilcox family because of their road interests later on. The Wilcox building still stands in Julian. It's been the office for Sprague Realty for many years, right on the north side of Main Street in downtown Julian. So let's real quickly go over some of the prominent backcountry ranch families who are found in the Julian Cemetery. There's a very large plot for the McCain family. John McCain was a rancher and eventually ran a hotel in Julian, and there's kind of a legend in backcountry ranching histories. McCain family, of course, other McCain family members settled McCain Valley down near Boulevard, near Highway 80. So very large backcountry family. There's quite a large number of them here in the Julian Cemetery. Another name probably familiar to many San Diegans is Daly. We know them more as Daly Construction and Daly Ranch, but the original Daly settled in Julian, were involved in several businesses there and ranching in the Julian area. And the Thomas Daly store building still stands on Main Street in Julian as well. So the Talley family lived down in the area near Harrison Park, which is sort of north of Cuyamaca's North Peak, kind of south of Julian a ways. There were several homestead ranches down in there. The Talleys were a fairly large family that was down in what's now Harrison Park. So they're also here in the Julian Cemetery, several different members of the family. Another of the longtime pioneer families in Julian was the Grand family. There's several generations and many members of the Grand family in the Julian Cemetery. Grand, the family lived on Vulcan Mountain and sort of behind on the north side of Vulcan Mountain, kind of leading down into the desert. They were also credited as being one of the first, if not the first, winemaker in San Diego County, sort of commercial winery. I'm sure the missions and things were making wine as well, but the Grand family had a winery down almost in the desert. There's really nothing left of it now, but very early vintners in San Diego County. And then the different generations of the Grand family were very prominent in Julian history. You see their name mentioned quite a few times in different relations to Julian. So let's start bringing things up into a little bit more recent years here as we look at some of these other graves. Frank L. Blanc was a preacher in Julian. He also owned the famous drugstore building, the mercantile store there right on the corner in Julian that we all know so well as the soda fountain. But the Blanc family plot is here on the hillside. So the Birdsell family were well known in Julian and Cuyamaca area for running sawmills. They had some other businesses like auto garages and things as well. But the original Birdsell started in the logging business in the Julian and Cuyamaca area. And these are the parents here. And then the other really interesting headstones up here, this big slab or a big log of petrified wood that says Bud Birdsell on it. That's the son. They were involved in the logging industry, and then more recently Bud's son is Roy Birdsell, and he was a longtime member of the Julian Historical Society. Real nice guy, lived down in Wynola and still had a bunch of the old sawmill equipment in his yard. Hopefully that's still in the family. Really neat relics to have. But Roy Birdsell is buried here as well. Kind of a poignant one for me to see. He was a really nice guy. When we were doing history talks and things in Julian, Roy was always really nice to see and to deal with. So another local couple who were very well known are Bud and Mary Farmer, because they owned Farmer's Mountain Vale Ranch down in Wynola. And for many years sold apples and bakery goods and pies and things out of the little store there by the roadside. I always remember Bud running around working the cash register and helping people pick out apples and things, and Mary would be in the back in the kitchen making the baked goods and things. I always went for either the cherry cheese bread, it was absolutely wonderful, or the cream cheese brownies. And when I was a kid, we always used to buy their apple candy. I remember many times driving down Banner Grade eating apple candy from Farmer's Mountain Vale Ranch. And just a few more recent people here. Jack Napierski bought what was the old Bushore homestead down in what was called Earthquake Valley. That wouldn't work very good for real estate development, so Earthquake Valley was changed to Shelter Valley. It says right there, it says founders of Shelter Valley. He and his wife Sandy. My father actually went to high school with Sandy Sebi. She later married Jack Napierski, but he's buried up here in Julian as well. So the founder and settler of Shelter Valley down in the desert. Before we close out with one last famous person here in just a minute, I just want to say I wish I had time, which I don't in a video like this, to go over some of the many families that are in here. Charlie Sauday was very active in Julian history for many years, and his wife Ruth. And there's just so many pioneer families in here, members of the Angel family. The Angel Ranch was up above Mesa Grande, way up in the mountains there. And other families like the Juke family, they were down in the Wynola area. So just so many people in the Julian Cemetery. Like I said, it's just a who's who of local ranch and business families. And then to close out the video with one more famous person here, we have Marshall South. This was a headstone that was only put in a few years ago when local historians figured out where they pretty much think Marshall South was laid to rest in the Julian Cemetery, because Marshall South lived on Ghost Mountain down near Blair Valley with his family in the 1930s. Wrote articles for Desert Magazine and wrote some sort of pulp western books and everything as well. So very famous backcountry resident during the 1930s, Marshall South. So they determined this was probably where he was laid to rest, because sort of out of process of elimination, it was pretty much the only grave from that period that hadn't been marked, and they know that he hadn't been marked at the time he was buried, so they figured this is where he was. So while I tend to specialize in finding historic places, I'm not that great with family history, so I rely on people like David Lewis, who wrote this book, Last Known Address, History of the Julian Cemetery. Wonderful book about the pioneer families and the different people who were buried in the cemetery, and stories about their life, lots of nice photos and everything. So if you're interested in Julian history, you definitely need to get a book of David Lewis's book. So thanks for joining me on another San Diego's Historic Backcountry. Hope you enjoyed our look around the Julian Cemetery today and some of the interesting people who are here, people who I remember as well. So Until the next time, take care.